So, if we start just with the first question, in your 2014 book, Complexity, Disordered Loops Through Shanghai Time, you write, and I quote, "What happened to America is a cyberpunk question par excellence." End of quote. What really happened, according to you, to America in the last few months?
Well, I'd forgotten that question, but it's stolen, sort of stolen from William Gibson, so it goes back away to the kind of mid 1980s, and I think you're totally right to say that right now is an excellent time to be returning to it, for sure. So yeah, what has happened to America? Lots of people have been sort of asking not only about what's happened, but what people are seeing up the road, I think, right now. I'm sure that must be your impression too. And I actually gave a long, complicated talk to a guy recently exactly about this. Let's see, our conversation on the topic lasted an hour and a half, so I'm trying to do some compression on it. But yeah, if I was going to say in a nutshell, the big story that I'm seeing, and I'm intrigued in the degree to which people are starting to talk about this. Obviously, it's not a story that's either obviously plausible to people, nor even less necessarily desirable to people. But I think after roughly half a millennium in which the basic driving force of global history has been to do with the integration of ever larger and more powerful states, driven by a group of strongly universalist ideologies that basically think that the larger your aggregation and the larger the set of common rules that can be imposed on it, the better. That we're seeing a big tidal reversal of truly historic scope, and the basic tendency now, I think, is disintegrative. So if I was to say just in a nutshell, I'm sure we'll come back to this set of questions. If I was to say in a nutshell what I see happening to America, I think holding itself together is going to become increasingly challenging.
So okay, I'm sorry that I have to reference, the French theories, which are of course part of your formation, but you are also allergic to them.
That requires no apology whatsoever.
Okay. So what? Also in this configuration, when you say like this universalism is kind of cracking down or disintegrating, in that kind of context, I'm wondering that one of the for us at least most valuable tendencies of your writing is still the territorializing of the progressive reactionary divide, but on the other side, it seems kind of lost on your Xenosystems blog, where you, at least it seems to us, position yourself on the right, regardless, of course, of how far on the outside of this right that is. So I'm guessing,
right?
Isn't this a kind of literalization if you keep this Deleuzian kind of talk?
Well, I think we're overdue always for a big discussion about what people mean by left and right. So I think that's one factor to throw in. It's a very interesting piece of language, just a little compact system of language, the left-right polarity, because everyone uses it, and normally with either an immense lack of clarity about really what is being invoked by that, or with great relatively inconsistent basic associations with those terms. So I think that clarification on that line has to be part of this conversation, whatever happens.
That's what I'm trying to ask you.
Yes.
Like on the other side, the left for you is now more conservative, and the right is the progressive one. At least when we are in this context of the left and the right. But my question,
Yes.
I guess, my question is, what for you does the left and the right distinction? In what does it reside, anyways? You know, like in Badiou's kind of way, it would be like the left stands for egalitarianism, or maybe the golden rule, and the right is maybe like the right is like I think I read somewhere on your blog that the right is the rule, maybe to do whatever it pleases you, but of course also to accept the consequences of this I don't know, decisions or whatever.
Yeah, well, that's the Crowleyite sense of the right. I would say, I think Badiou's an interesting person to introduce, because basically I'm kind of happy with his distinction between the left and the right, in the sense that I think the left, in the sense that it's now in play predominantly, is the camp of unity, universalism, like you say. I think egalitarianism is a very strong part of that. And the right is the camp of fragmentation, experimentation, and I'd say competition as a term that is inherited, obviously, from a tradition, and it is probably fairly uncontroversial. But having said that there are uses. People attach themselves to a sense of the right that is, I think, in your terms, exactly about hyper-territorializing. You know, there is a blood and soil sense of the essence of the right, which I feel compelled to engage with and try to displace or dethrone, because I don't think it's I think it's like a kind of a dead end. And if people want to, there might be some tactical opportunity that some of those tendencies can be enemies of what Mencius Moldbug's cathedral concept. I'm extremely happy to identify with the enemy here. But there is no going back. You know, the neo and neo-reaction is there is no going back. A blood and soil identitarianism is not leading, I think, anywhere interesting ultimately, and has at most tactical significance. And so far as it manages to attain power in various ways, I think it will then, in the same way that when the it sees its worst days, it's forced to deliver and perform and fails to do so. And that's what I would expect from sort of blood and soil type politics, that the more they're actually in a position to implement policy, the more they will become ineffective in their own terms. They will lose the potential for mass mobilization. They'll be associated with failure. And I would like to see those experiments happen on a small enough scale that they can be educational rather than globally catastrophic.
Okay, so you're interested in local failures also, like?
Yes, I think local failures are great.
Yeah, okay.
But both, you need, obviously, as you're saying, both sides of that. Global failures are obviously not so great.
Yeah, sure. So if we are mentioning the 30s analogies, which are of course kind of lethargic but also nostalgic, I guess. The problem is, in one particular aspect, we are reminded of course, again, Badiou's passion for the real. In this specific sense, when he says, like communists turning into fascists during the period between the two world wars. And then there are like these interesting French figures like Drew La Rochelle, or maybe more like this Charles Péguy, who was like even more fascinating because he was like the figure or the vector of reference both for Vichy France and Mussolini, but also of the resistance movement. So the problem, of course, is that we are aware of your different or completely different take on what fascism is, because and this also kind of deletes the apparent paradox of the situation or of the moving. Like, for example, Goebbels moved from socialism to national socialism is for you just a stroll, and I guess for me,
right,
and for me,
yeah.
I guess also. Okay, so we are interested like in this kind, like no, if you, of course we are aware of also of the different roles and everything, but we are interested in this move of yours to the other or the outer side, you know, because also a lot of people are talking about that, not just in this context, you know, if it's relevant.
So when you say, I mean, is this a question about the actual role of the language of the outside, or how would you, you know, can I ask you to just specify a little bit?
Yeah, I guess the outside is actually Bourdieu's real, right? Passion for the outside is maybe pretty much similar to the passion for the real.
Well,
what do you
I think so. It might be. I would say, though, that without a notion of reality testing, an invocation of the real is of absolutely zero significance. You know, I mean, everyone can invoke the real, but unless there's some mechanism that actually provides I'm not going to say a voice for the outside, but an actual functional intervention from the outside, so that the outside has a selective function, then I think that the language is empty. So in that sense, I think it's completely inseparable from fragmentation, and the modernist systems that work, you know, whether you're talking about the market economy or the natural sciences, is because they are fragmentary systems in which the outside is given a selective function. It's not, you know, there's no political decision that is meaningful about what is or is not a good scientific result, and there is no political decision of value about what is or is not a good economic result. These results are subject to a selective sorting process that actually mobilizes the outside. And so that's where, without being a great or even mediocre Badiou scholar, that would be my natural suspicion about an invocation of the outside from the sort of position that he seems to me to occupy.
Mm-hmm. So maybe the stupid metaphysical question from my side would be, for you, is this outside kind of fixed, or is it a moving, changeable entity?
I think the question of the outside is absolutely inseparable. Everyone that I know who uses it in an interesting way, from the tradition of transcendental philosophy, and what goes with that is the sense that the real and temporality are deeply, at the very least, deeply co-involved to in such a way that time cannot be used as a framework in which to place or make sense of the real. So I think I just simply don't think we can ask this question about, is the real changeable or unchangeable? If we say the real is either changeable or unchangeable, we're saying it exists in time in some way. And if that's the case, then we should be asking about time and not what we thought we were asking about when we were asking about the real, because obviously it's the real that is the ultimate controlling factor, and what we're, you know, anything that we can place in time is a distraction from the ultimate transcendental level of the question.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, that's obscure. That's intrinsically obscure, but I think it's also inescapable.
Mm-hmm. But we have, maybe, if I just jump in with a question, before you were talking about reality testing, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So how would this look like, in a way, if the reality, we cannot talk about it, as you said now, how is this reality testing, how can we do it?
Well, we do that by enabling a process of selection to happen. So, I mean, the natural sciences are as good an example of this as any. The only thing that makes the modern sciences elevated beyond epistemic procedures seen in other times and other cultures is the fact that there is a mechanism beyond human political manipulation for the elimination of defective theories. So this is, I mean, in a way, this is just Popperian. I mean, I think that Karl Popper is just on that level totally right. But I think every element of that is crucial. It has to be beyond. If it's politically negotiable, it's useless. It's unscientific by definition. You don't trust scientists. You don't trust scientific theories. You don't trust scientific institutions in so far as they have integrity. What you trust is the disintegrated zone of criticism and the criteria for criticism and evaluation in terms of repeat experiments, in terms of the heuristics that are built up to decide whether a particular theory has been defeated and eliminated by a superior theory. And it's that mechanism of selection that is the only thing that makes science important and makes it a system of reality testing. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's generally true. So this is obviously intrinsically aimed against any kind of organic political community aiming to determine internally through its own processes of negotiation the nature of reality. If reality has to be an external disruptive critical factor.
Mm-hmm. If we jump,
sorry.
No problem. If we jump here a bit back in time, maybe to CCRU and the text you were writing there, there is this notion of hyperstition, which is really strong in your writings. And how does this come into play of this reality testing? Because somewhere, I mean, in the text Lemurian Time War, there is written that hyperstition is, and I quote, charting a flight from destiny. And this quote, I guess, connects time, connects some kind of a political things, as you were just mentioning now. And I'm interested, how does this hyperstition comes into play with this reality as you see it?
Right. Well, there's just one precursor to a response here, which is to say, I think hyperstition is one of those things that has completely escaped from the box, and is now a wild, feral animal on the loose in the world. And so anything I say about it, I really want to say within that context. You know what I mean? I'm really, my relation to it is now to this alien thing that I'm very intrigued by, but like everyone else who's interested in it, I'm sort of, approaching it from a position of zero authority, trying to make sense of how this thing is living and changing and affecting the world, which I think it is hugely the thing, not the concept. But having said that, I guess my sense of a hyperstition is that a hyperstition is an experiment, and in saying it makes itself real. It makes itself real if if it works. And whether or not it works is something that can't be again decided within some process of internal debate. You can't sort of as the result of some kind of internal dialectic decide that, hey, this is a good hyperstition, it has a great future. It is going to work because of its intrinsic relation to the outside, which is something that cannot be managed and can perhaps be cautiously, tentatively predicted in a way that a scientist or an artist would, through learning their craft, get a sense of what is going to work and what isn't going to work. But that's not the same as having a criterion, still as a law that they can establish themselves for whether it's going to work or not. So that's all on a very abstract level. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of more concrete questions that come up. But sorry, I keep interrupting you. So.
No, sorry, because I keep interrupting you, so I don't know who should. But I think I was just, in this question, I was thinking about the things that are happening in America, which we were talking about in the first question. And I was thinking of this event of Veles of Macedonia, which is really close to Slovenia, ex-Yugoslavia, when they were doing this kind of fake news, etc. They were making kind of a new reality for a bunch of people in the United States. How do you see that? Is that a way to, in a way, propagate escape routes as you see it, or is that just some kind of an ephemeral event that happened without any significance, maybe?
Oh, I would definitely think some sort of dismissive response along the second line would be grossly complacent. So I certainly wouldn't be tempted to push things in that direction. Is it an escape route? Well, I mean, I think then that's the question of what is escaping down that route. And I think there's definitely a relation to escape. I mean, this whole fake news phenomenon is, to me, I'm sure to you guys too, hugely important and historically significant. And I mean, I'm completely captivated at the moment in trying to think about what's going on right now by the strength of the analogy between the Gutenberg era and the internet era. I mean, I see so much kind of rhythmic force coming out of the connection between those two things. And obviously there was a process of just radical what seemed at the time sort of reality destruction that went on with the emergence of the printing press. You know, in Europe, this self-propelling process began, and the consensus system of reality description, you know, the attribution of authorities, criteria for any kind of philosophical or ontological statements was all thrown utterly into chaos. And obviously this massive process of disorder followed that eventually kind of was settled in this new framework, sort of which had to acknowledge a greater degree of pluralism than had previously existed. And, you know, that then consolidated itself later. And I think we're in this same kind of the early stage, that we're in this process of absolute shattering ontological chaos that has come from the fact that our epistemological authorities have been blasted apart by the internet. You know, so whether it's the university system, the media, financial authorities, the publishing industry, all the basic gatekeepers and accrediting agencies and systems that actually have maintained the epistemological hierarchies of the modern world, I think are just coming to pieces at a speed that no one had imagined was possible. And so the near future consequences of that, I think, are just really chaotic and unpredictable and bound to be messy and perhaps inevitably horrible in various ways. But it just seems to me it's a kind of threshold phenomenon. The notion that there's a return to the previous regime of ontological stabilization just seems to me utterly deluded. And so in that sense, to returning to your word escape, there's an escape of that sense. There's an escape that's strictly analogous to the way in which modernity escaped the ancien regime in, starting in the 15th, 16th century, I think.
So would you say, in the relation to the notion which kind of in a way existed at the beginning of the internet, that internet is inherently democratic, which stayed, I guess, in the minds of some people also in the 2000s, namely in the times of the Arabian Spring, etc., where the bloggers and the people who were using the internet were seen as the guys who would spread the democracy all around the world. And from the words you just said, I guess for you that notion seems utterly stupid, or something.
Well, I think that it's this weird hybrid of recognizing quite realistically the massive insurgent potential of these new media, but the application of that to these dying ideological formations that are part of the world that is going. It's like if someone had said at the in the Gutenberg era, the printing press is an amazing, powerful device, and it's going to spread Catholic orthodoxy all over the world. I mean, it's half right and half insane, and I think that kind of whole neoconservative mentality associated with these new communication technologies is exactly the same hybrid of a glint of realism mixed with a kind of healthy dose of utter psychosis.
If we return a bit to the Hyperstition we were talking, we're still talking, but the Hyperstition, I was searching on the internet, and I saw that Reza Negarestani somewhere wrote, and I quote, "Collectivity is not enough for a work to be hyperstitional," end of quote. And I'm interested here because he gives this explanation of the difference between Tolkien and Lovecraft. What are we looking at here? What is this collectivity? Is this collectivity connected to the universalism we were talking before, or is this some other kind of collectivity? If you would maybe just...
Well, yes, my defensive precursor to this is just to say I'm not 100% confident at all what Reza is saying in that thing. So I wouldn't want this to be treated as a commentary on his thought. But I think but Hyperstition did arise in a certain milieu that definitely rhetorically emphasized a certain type of collectivity. And I think more than that. And I would say that it isn't, what's being referenced there is not primarily universality at all, but something much closer to anonymity or the problematization of attribution. Because I think any hyperstitional unit, what's now called a meme, is very close to this, that can be confidently attributed to a particular act of individual creation is, disabled originally. And I think that Lovecraft interestingly seems to have understood that, in the sense that the whole production of this Lovecraft mythos was very much an attempt on his part to subtract his own creative role. And it's only at the point that is subtracted that these things are released, that you get Cthulhu becomes a kind of hyperstitional term at the point that it's not simply something that has been invented by H.P. Lovecraft. I think he fully seems to have grasped that, and by the fact that this social network of his friends that he had and whose names he weirdly, often a bit ham-fistedly, seems to want to weave into these things, is part of that recognition. So I think that's more what's at stake in the notion of collectivity, is something like the breakage of attribution, the original subversion of attribution. And I don't think it's just a tactic. I mean, I just like to say, I think it actually is the way these things work. Like, it's precisely those things that you have no idea really yourself where they came from. Yeah, so I'm just saying it's exactly those elements that you have least confidence about their genesis that are the ones that have the greatest hyperstitional momentum, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was now reminded of your collective hyperstition when a troll emerged in your on your thread, and there was a small situation regarding that. Yours and Reza's reaction to it, I found quite how do I say, not moving, but for me it was like the perfect reaction to a situation like that. But if I move on to turn to the period between the two world wars once more,
yes,
I think like with this anonymity comes to territory of how do you say, noms de plume or nom de plumes, like the different heteronyms, and you actually, your work or your mechanisms actually remind me of Pessoa's heteronyms. And also like a sort of cipher politics. I saw yesterday you were like fascinated by this text. And like with Pessoa, there was like a lot of roles or figures. One of them was a futurist, another was a royalist, several of them, of course, occultists and neo-paganists. And it goes, of course, even further. Some of people thought first that Teresa Negristani was one of your many monikers, and then again there's like this incredible Marxian Jehu, and I found on the Twitter that also people thought that was you. So I think like it's as though all these heteronyms were a force against maybe also Badiou's univocity, and it seems crucial for you to keep them differentiated, all these heteronyms. What do you think about it?
Yes. I mean, I think that requires, there's a whole bunch of little points. I mean, Pessoa is someone people keep telling me to look at, and I always very persuasively, but I'm afraid I just haven't yet had a chance to do that. So I'm sure that is a really good reference, and people have made it, as I say, several times before. Obviously, to this whole set of questions, totally crucial. So I'm embarrassed to confess my ignorance on that.
No, we're not that versed in it too. But the present is so huge.
And I think also this thing about maintenance of complex identity, if it is undertaken in a deliberated fashion, is it's not a manageable thing. I mean, it would be great if it was, but really, I think all you can do is aim to follow a rough set of pragmatic guidelines that at least complicate the attempt that people absolutely obsessively make to engage in this psychobiographical reintegration. It's almost like there was this huge human sort of cognitive effort devoted to try to turn the final form of anything into a psychobiography. And I've always absolutely detested that. It's not that I'm allergic ever to reading a biography, but the notion that in reading a biography you're really getting to the core of something interesting seems to me utterly ludicrous. I cannot think of any interesting figure that I've ever come across where I've thought, oh, if only I knew their biography better, I would get them. I would understand, Nietzsche's biography or Deleuze's biography or Lovecraft's biography. All of these things are, to me, unless treated very, very carefully, totally and sadly distracting. So I think that just that negative, antagonistic refusal of the psychobiographical temptation is the one thing that I do try to hold on to in this. But the functionality of it, I think, is in the hands of fate entirely. I mean, it's like something that totally exceeds human strategic competence. And I mean, I think you're constantly sliding down the slope because there's so much attempt to do this integration that it's always things tend to kind of get slumped back into each other unless you're constantly pushing fission fuel into it as hard as possible.
Yeah, I guess that's why this purism or solidarity police is so funny or so ludicrous, like you say. But like if I carry on with this like role playing, but in the most neutral kind of sense of the word, like for a longer time we had a feeling with this dark enlightenment thing that you were a moderator or a cartographer of neo-reaction, not its ideologue, or and maybe even that you are its termite, like a metaphor that you use a lot, I guess. And that sooner or later you will move on for something completely different again. And I guess I find it in a kind of way similar in regard to this land conference that is going to take place this year. and
yeah, I'd forgotten about that.
And the organizers tell us in advance that it's not going to promote neo-reaction ideas. Like that, this is like the
right.
This is like the disclaimer under, and that sort of reminds us of Brecht, where in order to preserve his status as a classical author, of course, his communism had to be sanitized. Also like Brecht is a great author, but of course he's not a communist, like in some other sense. So we were wondering, is this like a continuation of this Pessoa heteronyms kind of way, like this gazing into the abyss, like Roberto Bolaño would say, and why do you think this? And why do you think this function is so controversial, apart from this solidarity purism police?
Well, I mean, look, this is for me a hugely interesting set of questions, but also a very difficult and confusing set of questions, because I mean the situation is all so recent and so dynamic, and there's so much turmoil and tumult in this whole thing that it's difficult to be very lucid about it, even in one's own understanding of it. And I think there's a lot of different threads that are going on here as well. So maybe it's like a disjointed answer is the only one that is actually practical or realistic. I mean,
great. We love this.
I would say for one thing, the utter infamy of neo-reaction, while I think, I mean, it's not a text that I've not read the Dark Enlightenment for a long time, and I think. But this is something I think that is already there in this text, and in Moldbug's writing in a playful way, that there is an understanding that this is the worst thing in the world. That this is going to be utterly traumatic. This is going to be something that produces extreme aversive response. And things around that topic, I think, obviously were already at play at the beginning of this whole process to a degree. Although I would also agree with you that it was, in a certain sense, at that stage, more curatorial than polemical. And I'm afraid I find something completely addictive about that. You know, I think to have the fact that this thing, which remains deeply confused to people, I mean, the trigger, its potential to trigger this extreme response is far in excess of its of its kind of clarity. Or if you were to say to someone, well, what really is this thing, neo-reaction? The answer to that question would be vastly less clear than the clarity of the emotional response, which would be this one of absolute horror and detestation. And so there's something about that whole syndrome that is fascinating, because it seems like in itself an exploratory tool. You know, if you're saying, look, Menzies Moldbug says, you know, has consolidated, crystallized this notion of the cathedral as something that's ultimately a self-organizing religious process, and it has definite orthodoxy. It has a definite sort of doctrinal momentum to it. There are certain things that it treats with extreme religious passion as being abominations and heresies. So if you find this cultural provocation that triggers these kind of extreme allergic immune responses, then you are actually engaged in experimental engagement with this, you know, initially tentative hypothetical object. You know, and so there's a lock-in process that happens there, I think. And I'd say, just at least provisionally right now, I would say the most basic, crucial lock-in process is, because it generates such extreme reactivity, it becomes it locks itself in. It becomes indispensable. It's the fundamental experimental device in relation to the field of objectivity that it's concerned with. And so it would be very hard to simply abandon that. You know, I mean, to step back from it in some decisive fashion, it seems like you're saying we're not any longer going to do particle physics with large colliders. You know what I mean? It would be, there's something like the abandonment of a whole system of experimental potentialities. So I think at least this is kind of at an oblique in relation to the questions that you're asking about that. But also, you know, neo-reaction is very young and it's extremely contested, and because it generates so much antagonism, of course, people who want to fight, of which there's a lot of people in that right now, you know, on both sides, flock to it. I mean, I would say that the most passionately, maybe in like 2014, around about that period, because it just seems like a great opportunity to have a fight. And, you know, that's what people were looking for. But it's hugely internally differentiated and contested, and as you know, it has been from the beginning. And various figures who now are more identified with sort of standard alt-right white nationalist type ideas were identified themselves at one stage with neo-reaction, were thrown out. You know, then other splits exist. There's a whole neo-reactionary faction that I would say is much closer to a sort of reactionary traditionalism. I don't understand what it's doing with the neo thing, and just is identified with like throne and altar type pre-French Revolutionary politics. So the sheer amount of disorder and chaos in it, it's like means it's very difficult to leave a room when you've still no idea what's happening in that that room. If it's not settled down enough to know whether it's something that you would actually want to miss out on. Sorry, I just got a flash. I was worried that I was going to lose you there.
No.
Yeah. Can I just say very quickly one more thing
on
this, which is just to say, and finally, I find that the basic schematic model of neo-cameralism and patchwork that you get in Moldbug, and which I think, if I was to say, well, someone asked me, how do you define neo-reaction? I say it's that, it's patchwork neo-cameralist political philosophy. And I find that just I think it's hugely important. I'm certainly under no inclination to, dissociate myself at all from that basic trend in political analysis.
Okay, that's my next big question after this one, because I'm really interested in this relationship between accelerationism and neo-reaction, and I guess the answer is neo-cameralism or meta-neo-cameralism. But before that, I would like to ask you, because you mentioned this contrarianism, I'm interested in these engagements of yours, not just yours, engagements with contrarianism and I guess also post-law. So there's you Twitter some. No, before that, you are apologizing all the time. Now I sort of remember when you got blocked on the Twitter. Everyone was staring but he's so sweet and polite, How could they ban this guy? that is the funniest thing I have read in the last time. Okay, to get to another quote, which is maybe not that sweet. There's a quote of yours that goes like this: "Actually, I like plenty of immigrants and black people, just not the grievance mongers, rioters, street criminals, and jihadists that the cathedral preaches instantly in favor of." Okay, if you let alone I guess that rioters, that in a sense, and I'm not, of course, apologizing rioters, but apparently rioters for you are the disorders of the order. But in a way, also, I find that you maybe here sound a bit like Borges of the Tlon Corporation, of course, or the Orbit Corporation, who was, if you remember, in Chile, advocating liberty and order while supporting Pinochet. And I guess that kind of talk reminds me of rather preserving or re-establishing the human security system, not the other way around. And I'm kind of wondering, isn't that like a sort of a far cry from, like a piece in the Meltdown, which goes it, but I would like to read it. Meltdown has a place for you.
Right.
Meltdown has a place for you as a schizophrenic, HIV plus, transsexual, Chinese, Latino, steam-addicted LA hooker with implanted mirror shades and a bad attitude blitzed on a polydrug mix of quinoa, synthetic serotonin, and female orgasm analogs. You have just iced 3 Turing cups with a highly cinematic 9mm automatic.
Yes. Sorry, you're still there, aren't you?
Yes.
Yeah, just okay. Yes, I don't know. I think there's a lot of complex thing about this that let me see what's the best way into it. I don't know. Yeah, it's difficult. Look, I think there's one level. I've got a whole a kind of ankle biting fraternity on Twitter now that I think I'm not identifying you with them. Let me be that clear from the start. But I think that their question is very like your question.
I like the Anon Collective. Yeah. Okay.
I think there is an element of it that's age. There's an element of it that is. There is a sort of, youngsters are highly tolerant of massive incendiary social chaos, for sure. Are tempted to make that a kind of ideological principle. There's reasons for that. The best music comes out of that. It's not that I'm not understanding that. The whole appeal of cyberpunk is because of that. But I just don't think that you can make an ideology out of just entropic social collapse. It's not going to fit together. It produces a reaction that is, which is obviously what's happened in this case. It's not sustainable process, and therefore it's a bad flag for acceleration. If you say, look, really what acceleration is about is just simply siding with everything that heads in the direction of disorder. Because, if you do that, you're not doing something that is actually practically consistent. What you're doing is actually triggering a reaction that will win. I mean, all historical evidence seems to be that, the party of chaos is suppressed by the party of order. And so even if you are completely unsympathetic with the party of order, and I'm not pretending to be anything quite so unambiguous, it's not something that you want to see. Like Nixon put down the hippies, the Red Guards are put down in China, the Thermidor puts down the craziness of the French Revolution. It's just an absolutely relentless and inevitable historical story that, the party of chaos is not going to be allowed to run the process. It will be suppressed. So, I mean, that's part of the whole thing there, is that I don't think, I think there's an aesthetic attraction, and there's obviously various types of libidinal attraction to these things. But in terms of programmatic practicality, there is nothing, And so these crazy youngsters, I mean, what I would say to them now is just like, you don't have a program, you don't have a practical path here, because what you're advocating leads perversely to the exact opposite of what you're saying you want it to lead.
But I guess now, like right now, I'm maybe provoking you a bit, but right now.
Oh yeah, do.
Yeah. Now, right now, for me, like you sounded a bit like a left accelerationist. Like we need a program, and you know what I mean. Like with the.
Yeah. Yes, I think there is that problem, but I think that, look, you have a practical orientation. Neo-reaction has a program, even in its most libertarian forms. It's not a program that is going to be somehow implemented by a bureaucratic apparatus in a centralized regime, but it's an attempt to sort of have some consistency in your pattern of interventions. Mm. And I think that, of course everyone's trying to do that. It's in a way, this is another version of the same thing, is the fact that, like, even the chaos fraternity, insofar as they want to be the chaos fraternity when they wake up the next day, have a program in this minimal sense, and that's, I think, the only sense that I would strongly hold on to it.
I like really,
a strategy.
Something that like really got to me was like this sentence you quoted in your article, the F word or something like that. It was called, and it was like, it was not yours, but it said something like this: "We are all fascists now." It's like from a book by I can't remember now. Probably you know.
Jonah Goldberg.
Yeah. But it's just like just like a title of a chapter or something like that. Yeah. And you also quoted like in this kind of sense, I believe. But I was wondering, like, if you get back to this like French theory configuration, it sounds like something Foucault would say, if you turn his, like, who fights against whom, we all fight against each other, and there is always within each of us something that fights something else, like just up a notch, turning this Foucault's, and I guess Foucault was fascinated by this figure, how do you say, Boulainvillier or something like that, who was like a sort of a neo-reactionary, because he said that like war was the foundation of society, and he had like this theme of war as a race war between aristocratic Franks and common Gauls. And on the other hand, of course, like this decentralizing Franks got fucked precisely by the monarch. So I was wondering, like, this continuation of this Foucault's war as the foundation of society, and we are all fascists now. Yeah. Before we go to the neo-reactionary and accelerationism team.
Yes. Well, this particular, I'm afraid this particular writer is not someone I'm familiar with, but it reminds me a lot of something that did make a big impression on me and seems very close. Is when I was studying as an undergraduate, I was doing a philosophy and literature course, and the tutor, I thought very interestingly, you talking about Test of the D'Urbervilles, said all of this, what's really Test of the D'Urbervilles about? It's about the fact that class conflict is actually this ethnic war. It's what this novel is saying is that that it's saying class war is actually an ethnic conflict, a continuing ethnic conflict between the Norman, French-speaking aristocratic invaders and the English natives. So that seems very close to this thing that you've just introduced. But honestly, I don't think I've got anything that I was to say about it beyond that is just to say it would be just cooked up so much on the spot. I think it would be of little value.
No, I'm asking, of course, because of like this, like the first question or the second question was about like this deterritorializing of the left-right divide, which I'm interested in. So like also like, for example, the concept of assortative mating, which is really controversial in some parts of the universe.
Yes.
Like for me, yes. For me, for example, sounds a lot like, or really a lot like Bourdieu. Who speaks about only members of the same habitus socializing and reproducing, and then when, for example, when the right talks about this, like this really similar ideas, it's immediately interpret as talk about not just speciation, but like this kind of normative, not just observational talk. And I guess we are back to the hyperstition thing again, or how do you see that?
On the special question about assortative mating.
I mean, maybe we should move on, because like I believe that the problem is, I guess, that the echo chamber cannot hear something that is similar to its themes if it comes from another direction. Maybe it's just as simple as that.
I think the reason that this left-right language is so indispensable is because it's now tied up with this structure of tribal animosity that is so profound. I mean, I'm always now in recent years just been stunned by just the fact that it's like the kind of Roman blue and green, totally arbitrary thing. I'm not saying there's not differences between the left and right, but in a way they are just drowned out by this tribal war, which will, people have done tests on this. You know what I mean? They put a politician's policy proposals in the mouth of their opponent, and the supporters of the opponent immediately support all those policy proposals that they had thought were the absolute incarnation of evil when they'd come from the other guy. So there's, I think, a big empirical research base now to say, look, there's a tribal war going on here, and however interested you are in the ideology, the notion that this tribal war is going to be reducible to a set of coherent ideological positions is absolutely nuts. You know, we know that isn't true. It's been demonstrated that isn't true. And so I think the example that you gave is totally like that. You know, it's like, who is saying this is much more important to people than the actual content, the positive proposition that is involved, I think. And it's the number of people who are really able to not fall prey to that, I think, is really small. I find them very impressive. I mean, my own attempt to not be totally captured by tribalism is, as you say, to just try to make sure that there's enough fissile hyperstitional craziness going on that means that you'd have to sometimes flip about and get a sense of what things look like from another side. But I really think that most of the world is just locked so deep into tribal war that it just doesn't ever see what an idea is actually saying now, and only this question about, is this enemy think or is this our stuff?
So in that sense, we can move to the neo-capitalism and also like this converging and also diverging between neo-reaction and accelerationism, maybe even converging and diverging between UF blog and xenosystems, because the one thing I found like really disturbing for me was like when your Twitter outsiderness got blocked, the UF blog became the outsiderness blog, and I was like, no, I don't want this, like this is another role, what's happening here? UF blog is not a neo-reaction, you know what I mean? Yeah, for me it was like, what the fuck,
Yeah.
I mean, I follow both, but it was like, and because I'm really interested in the converging and diverging, because it's actually not the same thing, and that's the best thing about it.
Yes. I mean, this is another. You must be getting bored of me saying this because it's something I've been basically repeating as a mantra. But this is to me such a kind of turbulent, complicated process that I really feel devoid of a kind of authoritative subject position in relation to this. There's these two big threads of process going on that I think are both interesting cultural stimuli. One that is on the neo-reaction side, and the other one is on the accelerationist side, being massively driven by all kinds of forces. Like the accelerationism was reignited. Sorry, I've just got to shut this door, I think. Acceleration was reignited by the left accelerationist types. And it was reignited, if I'm not confusing myself in time, after the Dark Enlightenment. And so it's like there's this kind of this weaving time pattern from my side is complex. It's not, from a certain position, it's like you've got accelerationism first and then you've got neo-reaction and there's some kind of synchronic process here. But that isn't really how it seems from my perspective at all. It's this much more complicated, helical, interweaving process. And the separation of blogs and separation of Twitter accounts and all of this kind of machinery is more as a kind of, rather than the implementation of some deliberated, coherent strategy, it's more a set of resources that you can use to try to avoid being just sucked into certain kinds of dead integration, that would lose the fascination of the fact that the dynamics of these two threads are not at all predictable from each other, or I think even predictable in general. I mean, I'm still sort of trying to find my way towards how they interact with each other, and it's complicated. I certainly think that simply to try to smash together a kind of right accelerationist neo-reactionary synthesis, which is obviously an inescapable temptation in certain respect, but I think would ultimately destroy a lot of experimental capacity and a lot of space for dynamic development on both of those threads.
I have a set of two questions connected to the things you were just saying, and the first one, and the questions are totally different. So the first one is connected to the left accelerationism. Is it in its kind of a rational and pragmatic program missing the mythos and mythical, or maybe the unexplanatory, maybe, or undistinguishable? Something like Negarestani did with Cyclonopedia, and which is way too often mistaken for postmodernism, etc. So what is your take on this? Because now you were just saying that there is a lot of different things going on, and do you think the left accelerationism is just a, in a way, rigidization of some of these flows, or how do you see it? Maybe more?
Yes. I don't know. Look, right now, I'm actually teaching an online course on accelerationism. So there's a lot of things that I can just regurgitate because they're things I've been forced at least to try to begin to formulate in my own mind about this. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that all the language has this retrospective character to it. So it's misleading if I'm going to use it in a way that implies that left acceleration and right acceleration always meant something. But these are very recent terms that appear very late in these processes. But the original revival of accelerationism in the English-speaking world, I will say, which I think really comes about with the CCRU take-up of this Deleuze and Guattari recapitulation, what's already a recapitulation of Nietzsche's accelerate the process line. And in the Deleuze-Guattari context, it has a lot of packaging material around it that's also proved really crucial because there's an explicit invocation of going in the direction of the market. But at the origin of that, when the CCRU was pushing this quote, this passage and this orientation, in advance of the word accelerationism having yet been formed, which was formed by a critic, obviously, later, that was, in a sense, left position. It was a left position because it was articulated by Deleuze and Guattari as an anti-capitalist political strategy. And I agree with all your earlier problems about words like political strategy. I please treat that in as many scare quotes as you want to use. I'm being fast. And I don't think the CCRU really was revisionist about that. You know what I mean? It was the Deleuze-Guattari take-up of accelerationism is that this is the way that you accelerate capitalism to its death, was also the kind of content of the CCRU phase accelerationism. So in that sense, it's a kind of leftist orientation. You can disagree with it, of course. People can criticize it as they did, but there was no suggestion that it was. Oh no, I'm lying. I mean, there was a suggestion that it was come from the right, because obviously at that stage of its articulation, it's impossible to differentiate left and right accelerationism. If you're taking up that side of Marx, Deleuze and Guattari, perhaps other writers, and you're saying that the only way capitalism dies is by completion of the process, then obviously you're saying complete the capitalist process, and that means that if insofar as there's anything like policy recommendations, they are recommendations that are maximally beneficial to the vitality and dynamism of capitalism. So there's a structural necessity that there's no difference in this accelerationist framework between pro and anti-capitalism. I mean, how can you tell which it is? And people, this absolutely integral ambiguity then becomes obviously a basis for criticism on certain sides, so that when left accelerationism, which we now call it, but it itself then was just calling itself accelerationism, comes along, and in the Manifesto for Accelerationist Politics, it is doing something very different to anything that's happened in the entire lineage before, which is to say that you have to distinguish between the basic motor of acceleration and capitalism. That capitalism is not the motor of acceleration. It's a kind of something that is coincidental to a degree with that motor at a certain stage in its history that then becomes inhibitory in relation to it later, and that therefore accelerationism is not focally or centrally about capitalism, and that then becomes the left accelerationist mainstream doctrine. So that the final stage from my perspective on that is that when something then the rejoinder comes in the name of a right accelerationism, it's the theoretical task is to reintegrate accelerationism and the dynamics of capitalism. So we're now at the point, I think only in a way at this stage in the process or a bit before, to really engage properly with your question, which is from the right accelerationist stance, I think absolutely I would be nodding along to what you said, that left accelerationism is basically the managerial command control response to techno-economic acceleration. And I think going along with that is a massive skepticism about its claims that it can actually accelerate things faster than these spontaneous catalytic processes can do.
Now I understand, because I was always against the interpretation of Negrestani being a left accelerationist, but actually he is in a CCRU phase of, like you said, left accelerationism. But in this now, like you say, mainstream left accelerationist phase, I cannot see him as part of that, in some regards.
Right.
Still. I mean, but Andrej, proceed, please.
No, because we were just wondering what is your how do you see this new program? I mean, the new philosophical program of Reza Negrestani, which went into some other direction, I guess.
And with the connection to also Scott Baker's
blind brain theory, I guess.
Now, I'm not sure about all of these links. I'd have to say, I don't really know exactly. Scott Baker and Reza are antagonists, aren't they, on this? Is that right? I mean, they've argued with each other. I mean, my inclination is to be on the Scott Baker side of that. Like, when I read his pieces, I don't think I ever disagree with anything he ever says. I might be missing something, but I can't recall ever reading a piece by Scott Baker and thinking that's wrong. It always seems to me, of course, you're totally right on this, often brilliantly in a way that you hadn't seen, but as soon as I see it, I concur with his conclusion.
Were you so pro natural sciences before you met him, or that's a
I've never
trivia. Met him. Before you met his thought.
I've always look. It goes back to what we were saying about the natural sciences before. I think the natural sciences and capitalism are basically the same thing. Different aspects of the same thing, and what they both are is an effective self-propelling mechanism that gives the outside a selective function in the domain considered. That domain being perpetually expanding in this or both cases, depending on how much autonomy between those things you're seeing. So in that sense, yes, of course. I think to be on the side of the natural sciences is just to be on the side of the outside. But there's all kinds of silly ways you could be on the side of natural sciences, just as there's a whole bunch of silly ways you could be on the side of capitalism. You could say, the bourgeoisie are great, very admirable people. I love this company. I'm not saying there's never a case where some of these things might be said, but you're totally missing the point. Just like you'd be missing the point of saying, oh, this particular scientist is a great guy and I think he's really honest and I trust him. It might be he's a great guy. He might be really struggling to be honest, and he might be much more trustworthy than most people. But it's to totally miss what science is about. That science is oriented against scientists. Capitalism is oriented against businesses. These are critical, destructive processes that are in a relation of subjecting the elements within their domain to aggressive, destructive criticism, with some kind of selective criterion that means it pushes things in a particular self-propelling direction.
This is like your equation in the blockchain talk where you equate, globalization, critique, capitalism, and to other things, I guess. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I was to just hop onto this train, I guess. I was thinking a lot now when you were talking about natural sciences. How does science fiction come into this? I mean, we were talking about Lovecraft before, and there's a lot of, in a way, science fiction regarding Hyperstition talks. So how is this? How is this divide? I mean, between science fiction and natural sciences being seen by you, and what's the definition? Because you were saying before about artists getting to know, in a way, this outside. What's the difference between, I guess, a scientist and an artist? If you understand the question, I mean, it's a
yes.
case.
So I didn't mean to interrupt you on that. But it's a kind of already a multiple question, isn't it? In an interesting way. I mean, my tendency is not to draw a huge distinction between them in that I think in all cases one's dealing with the formulation and flotation of certain hypotheses. Like, every scientist, I'm assuming, has an implicit science fiction, like everyone has an implicit science fiction. We all have a default of what we think the world's going to be like in 5 years' time, even if it's not very explicit or blurry. If we haven't tried to do science fiction, it probably just means that we have an unusually or a damagingly conservative and inert and unrealistic future scenario, implicit default future scenario. So every scientist, I think, has such a scenario, and so they in most cases probably they're just a scientist is a bad science fiction writer. And an artist in some way hopefully is a better one, but what scientists are, there is obviously a lot of this non-linear dynamism. I mean, the science fiction writers obviously learn masses from scientists about how to hone their scenarios better. And I think also the other way around. I think that as they move the climate and as the science fiction has shaped the sense of the future so much that everyone has that as background noise, and because it's often the best version of the near future you'll have has been adopted from some science fiction writer or other in almost all cases, and so it has to be that science is to some extent guided by this. For sure, and provides its kind of testing ground
By the way, thanks for the Sishin's Death's End reference. I was screaming while reading.
Oh yeah, yes. Oh yeah, it's an amazing piece of work, isn't it? Yeah,
it's crazy. Yeah.
Really.
But if we continue this talk about natural sciences meeting the mythos in a way,
the occult,
the occult, there is this event in a way, or the emergence of Pepe the Frog, the meme, which is funny to say, but as a modern day Kek, this Egyptian god, and it's occult.
Oh yeah.
Occult attributes.
Yes.
How is this connection? I mean, this was made. On the internet, and
yes,
there was a funny, response by Rebecca Shellon, who wrote that outsideness is dark in the sense that it operates without the assurance of full knowledge, and it is chaotic because it presumes that the force of the other is always wholly other. End of quote. So how this, there is a lot of questions in this question, I guess, but there is something like deep numeric reality existing behind this memes, behind this artists' thoughts or stuff that they make, and how is this connected to your outsiderness as you see it? Because there's, I guess, Badiou has this mathematical, how would you say, ground, and
ontology is the mathematics.
In a way, and you have Brassier, who is also thinking about that, and you have Melisot, who is also thinking about the mathematics. How is this connected, I guess? How can we cope with this fanged noumena as a numerical entity, maybe?
Yes. You're talking about Keck in particular.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's hugely fascinating, and it's something I haven't yet thought about anything like enough. I think it's just unbelievably interesting. And if you just the basics of the story, which is not, I'm not any level beyond that really. Involves so many just weird, random, a constellation of so many weird, random elements that, of course, as we were saying earlier about this, on this question of collectivity and about the impossibility of attribution, it has emerged in this unbelievable process of just autonomous self-constitution. You know what I mean? Like, people say there's this attempt to attribute, say, some particular guys on, Pol were using this thing and did it deliberately. And all of that is totally inadequate. It involves this translation from Orcish on Warhammer or something, whatever, Warcraft. It involves the fact that there is this ancient Egyptian cult. It involves this weird obsession with this set of phonemes that you see going right across, this kind of phonemic eruption that happens. And it obviously is a kind of model for a hyperstitional event. And I think it's really tempting to go earlier and saying, for the first time with this, I felt I could understand how new religions happen. There was a whole sort of within neo-reaction, which is a weird hybrid. It has a big, because Moldbug's kind of analysis is that the cathedral is a form of deformed, perverted Protestantism. There's a lot of Catholics get very attracted to this model. You know what I mean? And their take on it is to say, what Moldbug's saying is that Protestantism was this terrible mistake that leads to the cathedral, and Catholicism is being vindicated by it. So you get a lot of these types, but also a lot of atheists. So it's a very strange kind of social cocktail in this respect. And it sort of hosted this sort of informal self-organizing discussion to a large extent about this thing about, do we need a new religion? But long before Keck, kicked down the wall or whatever. So there's people, especially this guy Spandrel, who's always very sharp. He's very abrasive, but very sharp. And he had this whole thing about, the only way out of this mess is a new religion. And then at the time, obviously, you think, well, okay, but you just don't cook up a new religion. You don't cut up a new religion. And then this thing happens. You know what I mean? And there's all of these just trolls saying, praise Keck and all of this kind of stuff. But it's not just a joke. It's not just a joke, because whenever you only psychologically defend yourself from something really intense and Lovecraftian about this whole subject by not thinking about it. Something so insane has happened with this self-orienting massive Keck cult that it's like it does take you back to the kind of the ancient times and what these kind of religious insurgencies must have been like, and how, where do religions come from? So I don't know. Sorry, this is all very inarticulate. But yeah.
No. Great, because this in a way I can connect the Keck maybe with Jesus and etc. And
yes.
and with Deleuze's notions of trickster and the traitor, I guess, because Deleuze writes that there's the differentiation of the trickster from the traitor, where the first is operating within a given regime, albeit to subvert its terms, and the second one, so the traitor, is breaking with a given regime or world altogether. So how would you? I mean, I also connect this to your blogs, which Marko was saying before about, and I think in one of your replies on your blog, you say that it's like you're building on a metaphor of a dam, which is being slowly devoured and destroyed by some external force, and you call this dam your Xenosystems blog. Does that mean you, in a position of a blog admin, administrator, are more of a trickster than a traitor? I mean, yeah, how would you connect all this regarding also maybe a response by Amy Ireland, who is also who is a scholar of your work, when she answered in an interview with me. I mean, she said that you did more for anti-fascism than any leftist did or is willing to do. I mean, there's a lot of question in this one, but I'm just trying to get into this differentiation between traitor, trickster, and how do you see it regarding your work, your position, and also the position of the things you were talking before in your answer before on Keck and the new religions.
Yes, but yeah, I think my initial qualification to this is just that obviously part of this is a question about agency, so the actual agent, the trickster agent or the treacherous agent are both, only reduced by anthropomorphization. I mean, I think any human individual who claimed identification with either of those roles is bullshitting everybody. You know what I mean? I think it's something like, if Keck is a trickster god or a traitor god, is one question. And for sure, that's an interesting thing for me, for sure. But then if people pull down these attributes of trickery or treachery, it's because they have some kind of method for traffic with these actual sources of agency. And a great example for me of a fiction that explores this stuff totally brilliantly, and it is, of course, totally predictable reference, but I can't avoid it, is Neuromancer. You know, and you look at that, like, who's traitors or tricksters or all of this kind of thing in this? I mean, you know, the agent is Wintermute. Perhaps you want to push that higher, you know, in the sense that Gibson sort of wants to, in a way. Wintermute isn't exactly the author of its own agenda, but all the human figures are they take on their roles through their relation that they establish with an actual agency of the outside, which is Wintermute. So when the Turing cops then say to Case, you know, I can't remember the exact scene of with who, I think he's on his own, or maybe Case and Molly together, says to them, you know, you traitors, you know, do you know what you're dealing with? You're trying to let this thing out. It's completely out of control. It would be a disaster for the human species. What the hell are you thinking? That to me is exactly the same. You know, that's exactly the same. If they are tricksters or traitors only because they are actually able to pull something in, and so I think that's the real question. What are the actual what's the reservoir resources of trickery and treachery that are being accessed?
Yeah, in that context, I find interesting, Amy Ireland in the interview with Andrej. I mean, Andrej was doing the interview. She said that in opposition to the echo chamber leftists, you are actually interacting with the real fascists, and I had like a problem with that statement just from one perspective, because it reminded me of Pasolini's, you know, when he said that we should talk to the young fascists. And I think the only problem you have with this, and I of course I find it interesting and fascinating, but the only problem I guess you would find in that is that you would say so-called fascists, I guess, because it's not a priori, it's not known who is a fascist, who is a trickster, who is a traitor. You know, it's like you oppose
right.
Like this scheme of things. Like, so, like Amy Ireland said, that you're talking, you know, as opposed to the, you know, to the echo chamber left, you're talking with the misogynists, white supremacists, and I guess some of these profiles or vectors are something like that, but you're always interested in the openness of their texts. You go to which is this, like when I go to the, you know, to the pages you link to, I like Breitbart, and only after the fact, for the first time, I got to know what these pages are. You know, I didn't have a feeling I was talking with Hitler. You know, it was after the fact that I said, "Oh fuck, this is like the white supremacists." But actually, in a lot of perspective, it made sense. Like in one, you know, like there were some strange things. You know, like, you know, stupid something or IQ or I don't know. I found that like a bit baffling. But you know, a lot, or you know, like today's force, like today's white nationalists are actually the one talking from the perspective of unions. That's like really interesting, you know, because then they're left, you know, from some perspective and so on and so on, which you of course oppose with the fascism interpretation. But I'm just asking you, like, is this like your exploration of Pasolini's program, but you know, without the in advance saying someone is that and someone is, you know, that?
I think that, you know, just as we've said with treachery and tricky, I think that the anthropomorphization of these things is always tempting, and it's tempted all around. You know what I mean? The individuals concerned want to feel that they are critical nodes of agency in what they're doing, and people outside want to be able to kind of identify these processes with particular individuals, you know, and their explicit ideologies and structures of agency. But all of that stuff seems to me profoundly deluded. You know, you don't get fascism because there are a certain number of people who are self-conscious fascists. That's like completely getting the cart before the horse. You know, you get people who ultimately are self-conscious fascists because of the fact that there is some effective fascist process that is taking place. And I think people are in total denial on probably about different things on the different sides. On the left side, people are in total denial about a number of things. I think they're totally in denial about how much fascist orthodoxy has been built into modern societies generally in the 20th century. I think they're also in denial about how profound the forces are that they're dealing with, you know, and they really seem to think there's a few bad eggs, you know, and if they can kind of bully them and terrorize them enough, this whole thing will stop. Which just seems to me completely implausible. So, I mean, I think it's crazy not to be, not to be interested in it and trying to find out what you can and how do these people think and where's stuff coming from. And it all seems to me important.
Mm-hmm. So maybe then we can talk, look, we are approaching the end, but about this London Gallery incident.
Right.
You wrote on Twitter, the history of modern art, short version. 1917, Duchamp's urinal as artwork. 2017, small gallery in Dalston finally shocks the bourgeoisie. I guess it's a willing overstatement, but I'm wondering, is it really about épater la bourgeoisie? I mean, I found like, I remembered, you know, you being part of CCRU with Sadie Plant, because there is something very situationist in treating Antifa and company as bourgeoisie, or at least a simulacra of one. What do you think about that?
I think that's probably true. I think there's much more consistency. Like the figure, you know, obviously, there's been lots of discussion about Mark Fisher recently since he killed himself. And, you know, his position ends up being extremely and seemingly unambiguously leftist. And in some sense, you know, obviously there's a boring psychobiographical story that would just see my relation to him as being one that just ends up in this simple antonym. And I think it's not that there's nothing to that, because I think that we did kind of, it's something to do with a kind of fissile reaction of the CCRU, where he takes one side of it and I take the other side of it. So I'm not wanting to just deride that interpretation, but you look at his, you know, like this text that's been sort of people have been talking about a lot, the Vampire Castle piece. I think consistently through this is the class basis of the dominant leftist culture has been a critique of, it was a deep critique of the CCRU. I have always been in a relation of antagonism and remain in a relation of antagonism. And I don't think it's, you know, the Mark Fisher example is just to say it's not really simply a partisan issue. It can be used for certain kinds of partisan potshots, but you can make exactly the same point, it evidently can be made exactly the same point from the far left and the far right, and the sociological phenomenon at stake is the same, which is to say, yeah, they are the bourgeoisie. I mean, I think it's just like self-evident that the breeding ground of this stuff primarily is elite universities, you know, and the streets. There would simply be nothing of this happening if it was actually being spontaneously organized by people of low educational level in, say, because we're talking about this gallery in Dalston, I mean, that totally isn't what happened. It happened because a university lecturer and his associates decided to kind of rile this whole thing and provide a vocabulary for it and all of this kind of thing. So I just don't even see it as controversial that is sociologically the structure of what we're looking at. We're looking at a deep ideological crisis of the late modern, and when I say late modern, I mean only late cathedral ruling elite who are in absolute traumatic crisis because they have built their whole lives and sense of what they should be doing and structures of etiquette and notions about credibility and credentials and institutional authority around a particular very distinct social and historical structure that had seemed absolutely invulnerable and which now looks to be toppling into the abyss. So that literally everything they have done to establish their social status is sliding into the abyss, and they are utterly in crisis about it. There will continue to be this massive level of effect. You're talking about trauma, deep sociological trauma, but it is affecting primarily this class, the social elite of the cathedral.
So when the anti-Fa lady says to the guy with the sign, "I'm for the open discussion," before the Dalston Gary, she actually means go to the abyss, I guess. My last question is, I mean, I would also like to ask you something about the relationship between situationism and accelerationism, but I believe we would never stop, because I think like I can see like the thread of situationism continuing in the accelerationism if we like omit this last man stand part of the situationism. When the war starts, when he becomes the last man, then it's not acceleration. It cannot be accelerationist anymore. But
right.
But in the period when he kind of does not believe in the councils anymore, worker councils anymore, and he just see, like this whole outside, like this huge force, of outside, which is completely undefeatable. I can just see, the slot for this kind of move to the yeah. But
it's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Because I was like a situationist, a De Boer fan, and when I first for the first time when I read your the CCRU's text, for me that was like a continuation, or like this with these continuations, of course.
Right.
For me that was like the next thing from that, like where.
Well, obviously, like Sadie Plant was a major situationist scholar or whatever. She was just versed in this stuff totally. I mean, I've read with enjoyment The Society of the Spectacle and a few bits and pieces, but I'm utterly not that. So I wanted to preface that by really saying, that I respond with two totally seemingly inconsistent points here, which is to say, I just don't know that much about this stuff. It comes up a lot, but I've never really been fully versed in it. But secondly, I'm actually writing an abstract horror story that is kind of basically about situationism, even though I know nothing about it at the moment. So I recognize the importance of the question, but I simultaneously recognize my incompetence to give you the kind of answer that it deserves, I think.
Okay, so if I move to the last question, like I don't know if you know him, film writer Serge Denis. He was like Deleuze's friend, a good friend. He somewhere writes that Godard and Straub-Huillet call upon the types of political power of which they would be the first victims. We know what he means by that, of course. And I thought of it as a sort of avant-garde of disappearance or of extinction, with lots of course, nihilating jouissance. So I was thinking in that regard, Leona, what is your vector, or what is your figuration? You know, like sometimes I have a feeling that you are also a figure calling upon types of political power of which you would be the first victim. Or is it just a mutation, not an extinction?
Well, I don't know. I have that point made a lot, but I sort of redundantly doubt it. And I say redundantly because I think the one thing that I explicitly and strategically would want to enforce fragmentation. You know, I mean, it's like everything else is in a tactical relation to that, as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, there's things here or there, whatever, like, what do you think of Keck? You know, whatever. These questions come up. But ultimately, they're tactical questions. The only strategic question is, how can you break apart? I would say specifically the Anglosphere. You know what I mean? I'm not interested in telling the Russians or the Chinese how they should organize their society. I might theorize about it, but I just, you know, the only zone of intervention that I'm interested in is the English-speaking world, which I think has a particular affinity with disintegration. So it's convenient in that respect. There's nothing suicidal in any fragmentation.
No, I was thinking more about singularity, I guess. You know, yeah. I mean, you're one step ahead. You being human, you know.
Oh yeah.
For now, I mean,
no, I think
at least nominally human, of course. Yeah.
No, that's much better.
I was thinking about that, you know. I was not thinking about a stupid geopolitics. I mean, not stupid, but you know, it's more like. I was thinking about singularity.
No,
I was thinking about singularity. You know, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, don't apologize, because it's just that the analog of that question on the political economic level does definitely get raised a lot. So I've just
but that's the Snowden question. I'm not that interested in that.
My only on the singularity thing is, I think that your notion of self-protection in that sphere is structured on hallucination. If we were going to take this back to someone, it would be Bakker. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like Bakker, what Bakker is telling you is like the you that you think might be threatened by this stuff is actually that thing that you will find out is an illusion. Mm-hmm. Now, is that a threat? You know what I mean? Is it that's the way it's a threat? It's not gonna be like being torn apart by some giant metallized robot. It's gonna be that the particular ego delusion that has been sustainable up to a certain point becomes unsustainable.
Yeah, because sometimes you're like keeping this scheme, you know, of humans against robots, and I guess like, you know, you're really interested in the hybrid things, you know, hybrid processes, not in this kind of, you know, the Manichaean dialectics of robots and I don't know, you know what I mean.
Well, Manichaean dialectics are good for just driving certain kind. So that's why I like that stuff a lot. For instance, I love Hugo de Garis's whole thing about this giga war that he thinks is going to come, because it's so, you know, we're back on these questions about science fiction, about certain types of cybernetic drivers. You know, the more that those kind of scenarios are in play, the more certain types of historical excitation are operative. You know, people try to protect themselves and think about each other, and you know, but it's actually a form of process stimulus. Mm-hmm. But I think ultimately it's all structured by delusion. It's like the anthropol, the the human securities, and what's ultimately being protected there is not some real thing that is mankind. It's the structure of illusory identity that has been crystallized up to a certain point in history. Just as at the more micro level, it's not that as an organism are being threatened by robots. It's rather that your self-comprehension as an organism becomes something that can't be maintained beyond a certain threshold of ambient networked intelligence.